Hello, everyone, and good evening. My name is Paula Schmidt. I am the Interim Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean for the College of Professional and Graduate Studies. On behalf of Clark University, I would like to welcome you to tonight's lecture. We are pleased to have you join us for this annual Frederick and Emma Schemmel Endowed Lecture in Theology. As a Catholic institution, Clark University values opportunities to promote dialogue. Through genuine dialogue, we explore how faith and reason complement each other. We host conversations within our own Catholic intellectual tradition, with other faith traditions, and with science, culture, and politics. This public lecture series is one way Clark does this. The Schemmel Theology Lecture was established by a generous gift from Dr. Rachel Schemmel. Dr. Schemmel is a native of Farley, Iowa, and a Clark graduate. Now retired, she had a successful career as a professor of food science and nutrition at Michigan State University. We are happy to note that Dr. Schemmel is able to join us virtually this evening, and so we would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge her and to express our genuine appreciation. Thank you, Dr. Schemmel, for helping further theological conversation at Clark University. We look forward to hearing from tonight's presenter, Dr. Daniel Dileo, as well as from the Archbishop of Dubuque, the Most Reverend Michael Jacobs. They together will address us on the topic of climate change and Catholicism. Many thanks go to Clark Professor of Religious Studies, Bill Gregory, for organizing tonight's event. I invite Dr. Gregory now to introduce Dr. Daniel Dileo, Archbishop Jacobs, and tonight's program.
Thank you, Paula. Pope John Paul II once characterized the mission of the Church as a single but complex reality. The Church's mission is single because in every case it involves communicating and spreading the love of God in the world, in word and in deed. It is complex because there are so many different ways this needs to be done. So many people and situations in our world that cry out for hope and meaning and mercy and compassion and repair. As Pope Francis puts it, there are so many wounds, wounded people, wounded relationships, wounded families, and wounded societies. The Church's mission, in short, is the great work of healing those wounds and bringing the fullness of life to creation. Tonight is an opportunity for us to focus our attention on one wound in particular, the great wound of climate change, and on the part Catholicism can play in its healing. Our main speaker is Dr. Daniel Dileo. Dr. Dileo is a Catholic theologian and ethicist and director of the Justice and Peace Studies program at Creighton University in Nebraska. His teaching and research focus on Catholic social teaching, public theology, and climate change. Since 2009, Dr. Dileo has been a consultant with the Catholic Climate Covenant, of which the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is a founding member. Dr. Dileo, in just a minute, I will invite you to begin your presentation, but I wanted to take this moment now, first of all, to thank you for coming virtually and to welcome you to Clark University.
I appreciate the opportunity. Sorry, I was switching screens. Sorry, I appreciate the opportunity. This has been a wonderful experience so far to prepare this with you, Bill, and Paul. I'm so grateful for the introduction, and Archbishop, I'm excited to be in dialogue with you this evening. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dan. And as mentioned earlier, Dr. Dileo's talk will be followed by a reflection by Archbishop Michael Jacobs, who has been our chief pastor here in the Dubuque Archdiocese since 2013. Prior to that, He served 8 years as Bishop of Wichita and 8 years in the Vatican in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith under Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, now Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. I can add that before the pandemic began a year ago, I had only had the opportunity to hear Archbishop Jekyll's one time. But since then, I have had the pleasure of listening to many of his homilies online and have grown to really value him as a teacher and a pastor. So Archbishop Jekyll, I want to say we're very grateful that you also can be with us this evening.
You're very kind in your comments, Dr. Gregory, and I am honored and humbled to be part of this discussion this evening, a very important one, and hopefully I can contribute a little bit towards the topic. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me just add one more note by way of instructions. Following our 2 presentations this evening, we'll have some time for questions and discussion with our 2 guests. So to all of you listening out there, we invite you into a dialogue. You can post your questions and comments at any time as they occur to you throughout the evening in the question and answer bar on your screen. And later we will get to as many of them as possible. In fact, if you're a student, you could probably tell your professor that you will deserve more extra credit for asking a question just because of that fact. So consider yourself encouraged. At this point, without further delay, then let me invite Dr. Daniel Dileo to deliver this year's Frederick and Emma Schemmel Endowed Lecture in Theology, Climate Change and Catholicism, Climate Justice as Essential to Catholic Mission. Dr. Dileo.
All right, well, thank you, Bill. So as I said, I'm immensely grateful for the opportunity to be here this evening. This is something that, as you indicated, I've spent a lot of time thinking about and collaborating with a lot of partners in trying to work on practically in the church here at Creighton University. So I'm excited to share my experiences and hopefully have some good conversation about what you all have done, what you all are doing, and how we can work together to care for our common home. So as far as an introduction for this evening, I think my hope is that after this evening, you'll come away with the sentiment that's expressed here by then Bishop Skillstead, the former president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. This is the back cover of a toolkit that we published with Catholic Climate Covenant in 2010 for Catholic colleges and universities working on sustainability. And as you can see, Bishop Skillstead writes that care for God's creation is not a new component of Catholic identity. It is as old as Genesis and must therefore be integral to the mission, identity, and everyday life of Catholic colleges and universities. And he's obviously speaking here about higher education, but my hope is that you'll have an appreciation for how this is true more broadly for the Catholic community writ large, that care for our common home and climate justice are essential. As Pope Francis, as we're going to see, says, they are not secondary or optional add-ons to the fullness of faith. And so in order to get to that point, the way that I'd like to proceed this evening is essentially in 4 phases, the first of which is to talk about love and justice in terms of ecclesiology and missiology. So we'll talk about those terms, but essentially the church's self-understanding and its understanding of its mission, its reason and for existing and the work that it does. The second thing we'll do is we'll talk about care for creation, and we'll talk about climate justice as it relates to ecclesiology and missiology. The third part that I'd like to reflect on is the U.S. Catholic potential, but as I'll suggest, unfortunately, its failure to live up to the fidelity of its mission in terms of enacting church teaching on creation care and climate change. And then finally, I'll conclude with some insights that are hopefully empowering in terms of future pathways to thinking about how to more sufficiently care for our common home. And as folks are interested, I'm in many ways going to be pulling from an article that I published more or less a year ago in a journal here at Creighton University, but I put this just here for reference, and as you'll see, I'll be giving several references throughout the night to different sources in the hopes that folks are able to draw on these in the future. So you'll see several resources throughout the evening. And so in order to get into our topic, as I said, what I'd like to do is begin by framing the conversation in terms of love, ecclesiology, and missiology. And there are a lot of ways to begin this conversation, and the way that I have found most helpful in working with our students and working with Catholic Climate Covenant is to walk through what two Jesuit theologians have described as the schema of Christian life. This was developed by Ed Vasick and supplemented by Jim Keenan, and it essentially tries to hold together different dimensions of the Christian tradition, dimensions that unfortunately are sometimes separated but are essential to the fullness of faith. And so it's a model. No model is perfect, but I do think this is a helpful way to frame the Christian tradition. And it moves in roughly 5 steps, the first of which is what Michael Himes, theologian, describes as the least inadequate way to speak about God. God is mystery, God is the ineffable other, and yet because God has chosen to reveal God's self in scripture and tradition, we have this insight in 1 John that God is love. It's the least inadequate way to begin to speak about God. And this claim that God is love is related to the second step and the second claim that God loves us. Again, from 1 John, that the creator and sustainer of everything that ever has been, is, or will be personally and intimately loves you, loves all of us. And in the Catholic tradition, in the Christian tradition, when we speak about love, we mean something unique, and we can use love in lots of different ways. But at its core, when we speak about love, we're talking about willing the good of the other and acting to make that good real, willing and acting for the good of another, as Michael paraphrases Thomas Aquinas here. And so this claim that God loves us sets up the third move, which is underpinned by human freedom, whereby we have the capacity to love God or not. As I say to my students, you can't force love. And in the Catholic tradition, when we speak about accepting God's self-offering and God's invitation to loving friendship, this is technically what we mean by faith. As the Catechism describes, faith is the adequate response to this invitation. And faith is related to, but distinct from, several other terms, two of which are related, especially to our topic for tonight. The first is spirituality, which most broadly is understood as a relationship with God, and it's a relationship that's begun in faith. And within the context of that relationship, we can think about prayer as communication, and different ways of praying as different ways of communicating in this relationship. And presuming the exercise of faith that a person enters into friendship with God, the fourth step in this framework is conversion, metanoia, that we are transformed and we are different. And hopefully you can think about how this is true in your own life, that you're different because of authentic, loving relationship. I am different because of my loving relationship with my spouse. As I say to people, thank God, she is a saint. And if that's true of our human relationships, it's even more true of our relationship with God, who is love, that as we enter into friendship, we're changed, we're transformed and brought into closer union with the object of our love, namely God. And so as Ed Vasick writes here, union with God leads to union with God's loves. And so we will be inclined to love the neighbor whom God loves. It's what allows St. Paul to talk about putting on the mind and heart of Christ. And ultimately then, this schema leads to the fifth step, whereby we respond in and through and with love. Technically, this is what we mean by morality. This is the enacted response to loving friendship with God, who is love. And as we'll talk about here in a moment, this love is enacted in all of the different relationships for which God has created us, namely with God's self, but also with self, neighbor, and creation. So we live this love in all of those different contexts. And so, as I said, this is a model. This presentation is fairly top-down and deductive. For a lot of people, this is inductive and in many ways begins with experience, I think, especially for many of our students. But hopefully this holds together for you and kind of frames the conversation in terms of how these different pieces of the Christian tradition can fit together. And so what I'd like to do is to hold this over on the left-hand side here. So we've got the 5 steps of our schema of Christian life, and to consider what Michael and Ken Himes, 2 brothers theologians, have described as the fullness of faith. In other words, that all of these pieces are essential to the fullness of faith, and it would be impoverished to lift up or prioritize one to the exclusion of another. And hopefully in viewing this schema, you can appreciate what the theologian Richard Gula has described insofar as the schema makes the moral life spiritual at its source and the spiritual life moral in its manifestations. In other words, the fullness of faith is about spirituality and morality. As I say to my students, Christianity is not just me and Jesus chilling. It's not just personal piety and spirituality. It's inexorably connected to morality, which is the enacted response to that relationship. And so this is something that Pope Francis has emphasized for us in recent years. For example, in Evangelii Gaudium, he stresses that an authentic faith, which is never comfortable or completely personal, always involves a deep desire to change the world. So faith is not just personal piety or personal relationship with God. Ultimately, it's lived out in the world. And this is the ideal. Unfortunately, this isn't always the reality. And this bifurcation of spirituality and morality isn't anything new. As far back as the Second Vatican Council and the document Gaudium et Spes, the Catholic tradition recognizes or has recognized that this split between the faith which many profess and their daily lives deserves to be counted among the more serious errors of our age. In other words, having one or the other without the interconnectedness is a split that undermines the fullness of faith. And so this way of thinking about the Christian tradition as requiring morality is helpful as far as it goes, and ultimately though leads to a question. As Vasek describes, it poses the question, how can and ought we who've been loved by God live? It brings us to the point of beginning the process of moral reflection and discernment. And here it's important to understand or to recognize the connection between love and justice, because we've talked about love as essential to the fullness of faith. And as the Jesuit scripture scholar John Donahue has described, the biblical idea of justice can be described as fidelity to the demands of a relationship. When we see justice described in the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, it's within the context of the covenant between God and God's people. And so justice is related to fidelity. And in the New Testament, justice is described in terms of the law that fulfills the Old Testament, namely the law of love. So summarized in John's Gospel, I give you a new commandment, love one another. And so in the Christian tradition, in many ways, love and justice are synonymous, at least the biblical idea of justice. And again, this notion of love, and we'll use interchangeably justice, occurs within the different contexts and relationships for which we exist. And as Pope Francis describes in Laudato Si, these relationships include 3, and I'll say 4 fundamental and closely intertwined relationships with God, with oneself, with our neighbor, and with the earth itself. Again, that emphasis on love of self is what enables rightly ordered love of neighbor and creation. And this is, I think, what Jesus is getting at when he talks about loving the neighbor as yourself, presumes rightly ordered love of self. And so this notion of biblical justice as in many ways synonymous with love is the original meaning of justice. And here we see the U.S. bishops describing in their pastoral letter on racism, Open Wide Our Hearts, that this is the original meaning of justice, where we're in right relationship with God, self, one another, and with the rest of God's creation. And so we've got this notion of love and we'll say justice as essential to the Christian tradition, but love and justice aren't monolithic. They require different types of actions as responses to God's love. And we've seen this articulated in several different ways. In Laudato Si, I think Pope Francis gives a really helpful way of describing it in terms of love, where he describes that love overflowing with small gestures of mutual care is also civic and political. It makes itself felt in every action that seeks to build a better world. Love affects not only our relationships between individuals, but also macro relationships, social, economic, and political ones. In this framework, along with the importance of little everyday gestures, social love moves us to devise larger strategies. And in more traditional language, the Catholic tradition has talked about love and justice in terms of the 2 feet of love and action. So hopefully you're familiar with this language or this resource. This is from the USCCB, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And on one foot, or with 1 foot, the Catholic tradition talks about the foot of charitable works, right? So this is meeting basic needs and providing direct aid to individuals. So this is our students going and accompanying persons experiencing homelessness and doing tutoring, kind of the corporal works of mercy. And this is a wonderful, essential expression of love. It's necessary, but alone is insufficient, because from a Catholic perspective, the fullness of love, or biblical justice, also requires what the tradition has historically called social justice, namely work to remove root causes and improve the structures that necessitate charitable works in the first place. And so this involves reforming systems and structures and policies so that we don't have to engage in charitable works, or at least fewer charitable works. And so from a Catholic perspective, when we think about love and justice, it requires lots of different types of actions. And I want to underscore that, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes, talking about creation especially. And so we've got these 2 feet of love and action. But in addition to those, the Catholic tradition offers additional resources for answering this question: how can and ought we, who have been loved by God, live in the world? And this is where we can think about Catholic social teaching as a resource. Most formally, Catholic social teaching is the body of magisterial teachings that serve as a resource for moral reflection and discernment. So this includes all of the encyclicals, the pastoral letters, the statements that come from the Pope and other bishops exercising their pastoral teaching authority. And as the compendium describes, this body of teachings that essentially began in 1891 with Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum provides principles for reflection, it provides criteria for judgment, and the directives for action. And there are lots of different ways to summarize Catholic social teaching. This is a resource, again, from the USCCB that identifies 7 themes of Catholic social teaching that are really woven throughout all the different documents that make up CST. And so as you can see here, we can talk about Catholic social teaching as animated by a commitment to life and dignity of the human person, call to family, community, and participation, rights and responsibilities, the option for the poor and vulnerable, the dignity of work and the rights of workers, solidarity, and care for God's creation. And I think it's important to engage each of these themes on their own, and we'll do that in a minute in terms of creation care. But I also think it's important to remember what Francis emphasized in his encyclical Laudato Si, namely that it cannot be emphasized enough how everything is interconnected. Each one of these different themes is connected to the other aspects and commitments of Catholic social teaching, often in ways that we don't immediately or always recognize. And we'll talk about that in terms of creation care and climate change. But I think it's important that we not lose the forest for the trees, and that we have to remember the interconnectedness. And here I want to pivot back to talking about this notion of essential that's in the topic of the title of our topic for tonight. Because Catholic social teaching is essential. It's not just an optional add-on to the church's identity and mission. But I think in order to appreciate that, we've got to carefully define what we mean by church and how we understand the church's mission. Catholic social teaching is only essential if the church is understood in a particular way. And so this is where I want to move into ecclesiology and missiology. So ecclesia is the Greek word for assembly that's typically applied to the church, and so ecclesiology is the study of the church, and missiology is the study of the church's mission. And there are lots of ways to define or describe the church. We can talk about it as an institution, as a nonprofit, as made up of the magisterium. But most basically, the Second Vatican Council described the church as the people of God. So the church is the people. And it's a people whose law is the new commandment to love as Christ loved us. So the church is a people called to love. And when we think about what we just talked about in terms of love and biblical justice, I think here we can start to make some important connections, one of which is that biblical justice through charitable works and social justice that enact Catholic social teaching are part of the law of the church. It's that to which the church as the people of God is called. The church exists for a specific end, namely the kingdom of God, begun by God on earth and which is to be further extended. So the church exists, it's a teleological entity, it exists for an end, but that end, that kingdom is understood in a particular way. Again, from the Second Vatican Council, the kingdom for which the church exists is understood as God's kingdom of truth and life, a kingdom of holiness and grace, a kingdom of justice, love, and peace. And so again, I think we can make this connection back to biblical justice through charitable works and social justice that enact Catholic social teaching. So we're talking about God's kingdom as the realization and the enactment of biblical justice through these different ways of walking and living in love. The mission of the church is to advance God's kingdom. As Agentis, the conciliar document describes, the Pilgrim Church is missionary by its very nature. This is why the church exists. And it achieves this mission through the term evangelization. But again, I think it's important to define this term because, at least in my experience, evangelization isn't understood in the way that the council described it. That is, this announcing of Christ by a living testimony as well as by the spoken word. And I think in my experience in different times, evangelization hasn't always included the living, or at least the living in terms of the 2 feet of love and action, that there's maybe been an impoverished understanding of evangelization. And so when we think about the church, its law, its mission, evangelization, it's against this backdrop that we can begin to think about Catholic social teaching and work for justice as essential to the very nature and mission of the church. And this is what the World Synod of Bishops described in 1971 in its document Justitia in Mundo, Justice in the World, where the bishops together wrote that action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world fully appeared to us as a constitutive dimension of the preaching of the gospel, or in other words, of the church's mission. And so summarizing what we've talked about thus far, charitable works, social justice, and enactment of Catholic social teaching are essential to the church's meaning in fidelity to the fullness of faith that adequately responds to God's love. Catholic social teaching and work for justice is essential to the church and its mission. It's not an optional or a secondary add-on. So this is the foundation that I want to build on, this notion of love and justice and ecclesiology and missiology. So we've talked about this in terms of general notions of Catholic social teaching, but I want to spend a few minutes moving now into a particular topic, namely care for creation and climate justice. And in order to do this, I want to review Catholic teaching on this topic, but also engage the science that informs the church's teaching. And this notion of essential is something that the Catholic tradition has affirmed in terms of care for creation and the church's mission. So as far back as 1990, John Paul II, speaking in his World Day of Peace message, described that Christians in particular realize that their responsibility within creation and their duty towards nature and the Creator are an essential part of their faith. So again, this is essential. And we can think about this for several reasons. I'll suggest three, the first of which is that care for creation is related to love of God, right? We talked about love of God, self, neighbor, and creation as defining the Christian tradition. And care for creation is essential to love of God when we recognize God as both creator and sustainer of all creation. Drawing on the Ignatian tradition, we speak about finding God in all things. To the extent that we're going to love God, we have to love that which God has created and in which God continues to sustain and exist. So this is related to love of God. It's also related to love of neighbor because we are part of creation. As Pope Francis describes here in Laudato Si, nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it and thus in constant interaction with it. We are faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Environmental degradation harms persons whom we are called to love. And the third, so again, we talk about interconnectedness, and we'll talk more about how this is especially true in terms of commitments to human dignity, human life, the option for the poor, solidarity. And the third reason that we can think about this as essential is that we are called to love creation. And non-human creation in the Catholic tradition has its own intrinsic dignity, its own value. As Francis says here in Laudato Si, other living beings have a value of their own in God's eyes. By their mere existence, they bless God and give God glory. So we think about exercising love of non-human nature. And so for all these reasons, again, in his World Day of Peace message, John Paul II emphasized, I wish to repeat, the ecological crisis is a moral issue. This is a moral issue for the Catholic tradition. And as Francis, again, in Laudato Si emphasizes, living our vocation to be protectors of God's handiwork is essential to a life of virtue. It is not an optional or a secondary aspect of our Christian experience. And when we think about all of this in general, we can maybe appreciate that in terms of creation care. It's a little bit more difficult or potentially controversial to think about in terms of climate change. And so I'm going to walk through this, and just so we're on a common foundation. When we think about climate change, we're engaging the greenhouse effect, right? So it's this natural process whereby the Earth is surrounded by an atmosphere of greenhouse gases. These gases allow solar radiation to pass through in the form of shortwave radiation. That hits the Earth, which absorbs it, and then re-emits it out into space. And that re-emitted solar energy is converted into long-wave radiation. And that's significant because greenhouse gases don't allow long-wave radiation to pass easily through. They absorb long-wave radiation and they re-emit it in lots of directions, including back towards the Earth. And so that heat is directed back to the planet for another round of warming. And this is a natural process. Without it, the planet would be about 60 degrees colder than it is. And so this, for our purposes, is a good thing. The problem is that since the Industrial Revolution, we have thickened that blanket of greenhouse gases. So as you can see here, this is from NASA's website. This is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere going back 400,000 years. You can actually double this and go back 800,000 if you want to. And as you can see, there are cyclical variations that have to do with fluctuations in the Earth's orbit, in the Earth's axial tilt. But in general, we've never gone above 300 parts per million in terms of the amount of carbon dioxide in the planet or in the atmosphere until the Industrial Revolution, where we started to burn fossil fuels that pollute carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases at a level that we've never seen. And as a result, as you can see here, greenhouse gas emissions have gone up and up and up at a point where they should actually be going down. Again, this is something that the Catholic tradition has recognized. So this is, again, John Paul II in his 1990 World Day of Peace message talking about the greenhouse effect having reached crisis proportions. And I think it's important to recognize that he's speaking in 1990 about a crisis, at which point CO2 was a little more than 350 parts per million. Today, we are well over 410 parts per million. So he's speaking about a crisis 30 years ago, and we have gone up and up and up since then. So I think that's important to name. When we think about climate change, we would expect to see warming, right? As you put more blankets on a bed, you trap more heat, you get warmer underneath. And this is what we've seen in terms of the climate. So average global temperature has gone up a full degree since 1880. And this can't be explained aside from greenhouse gas emissions from human activities. So this is again from the EPA's website. Climate changes can't be explained by natural causes. Natural causes do not explain most observed warming. It's extremely likely that human activities have been the dominant cause of that warming. This is a graph from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Nobel Prize-winning United Nations entity. And here you can see in the blue the warming that has been or can be accounted for by natural causes. So not taking into account human activities. The red is warming that we would expect to see, including human activities, and the black line is the warming that we've actually seen. So as you can tell, what we'd expect to see based on what we've done and what we've actually seen are almost a perfect match. And so for this reason, as NASA describes, multiple peer studies in peer-reviewed scientific journals show that 97% or more of actively published and climate scientists agree climate warming trends over the past century are extremely likely due to human activities. And this is significant because it puts an impetus on human persons to take action. So this is from the US Bishops' document in 2001, and facing climate change, what we already know requires a response. Prudence dictates taking mitigating or preventative action, and prudence is understood as right reason applied to action in the Catholic tradition. So based on what we know, we have a responsibility to act. And that responsibility is especially acute in terms of what we have observed as the effects of climate change. And so there are lots of these different effects. I'm not going to walk through these. I've, again, given the citation from NASA's website if you're interested. But as hopefully you're aware, we've seen all of these geophysical effects as the planet has gotten warmer, shrinking ice sheets, declining Arctic sea ice, increased extreme weather events as warmer air has trapped more moisture. We've seen warming oceans. So we've seen all of these geophysical effects on the planet. At the same time, though, we have seen humanitarian effects. And again, it's because we are part of nature. So for example, as we have seen increased temperatures, we've seen increased incidents of food and water stresses. We've seen increased events of wildfires. This is a picture from California a couple of summers ago. As sea ice has, or as glacial ice has melted, sea levels have risen. People live along coastlines, and those rising sea levels displace people. And this is a study, a projection from Cornell University that says that rising sea levels could result in 2 billion refugees by the end of the century. This has human effects in ways that we don't always recognize. There are already what organizations are starting to call climate refugees all around the world, but including here in the United States. So this is a screen cap from the New York Times looking at some of the United States' first climate refugees down in Louisiana who are having to relocate and move inland because of the rising sea levels. But as I said, some of the connections aren't always obvious. So for example, climate change has been recognized by the US Department of Defense as a national security threat because incidents like food stresses and water stresses and population displacement tend to occasion violence, right? So this is something that has lots and lots of different impacts. And this is something that we've arguably already seen. This is a paper from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that talks about how the Syrian civil war was in many ways the result of droughts that collapsed agriculture in rural parts of the country and forced persons into cities that weren't equipped to absorb and provide for that many people. So climate change is an environmental issue, but it's very much a human issue. And it's related to human persons and those commitments of Catholic social teaching. So for example, the Catholic tradition recognizes that climate change is a life issue. As the World Health Organization says, climate change is already estimated to cause over 150,000 deaths annually. They also warn that between 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths. And so for this reason, for example, in 2010, Pope Benedict XVI asked this pointed question: how can we separate or even set at odds the protection of the environment and the protection of human life, including the life of the unborn? So we think about these principles of Catholic social teaching, we have to recognize how they are connected. We can also think about climate change in terms of racism or commitments to human dignity. In their 2018 pastoral letter on racism, the US bishops describe that racism can also be institutional when practices or traditions are upheld that treat certain groups of people unjustly. The cumulative effects of personal sins of racism have led to social structures of injustice and violence that makes us all accomplices in racism. So we think about institutional racism, and a couple of years ago, in its 4th National Climate Assessment, the U.S. Global Change Research Program, so the congressionally required climate assessment report, talked about how in urban environments, economically disadvantaged communities and communities of color live in neighborhoods with the greatest exposure to climate and extreme weather events and are therefore disproportionately affected by climate stressors. So we talk about climate change as related to racial justice. And again, this isn't anything new. I think we're just becoming more acutely aware of it. So the idea of environmental justice has been around for decades and was pioneered by Robert Bullard, who as far back as 1970 has pointed out and continued to point out that race is still more potent than income in predicting the distribution of pollution. If you want to know who lives closest to coal-fired power plants, if you want to know who lives closest to the wards in New Orleans that are most vulnerable to rising sea levels, don't look at income, don't look at education, look at race. It's the biggest predictor of vulnerability to environmental harm. And so again, we have to recognize how these things are connected. So as Francis reminds us, following the killing of George Floyd, we cannot tolerate or turn a blind eye to racism and exclusion in any form and yet claim to defend the sacredness of every human life. These are all interconnected. All of this is also connected to notions of justice and responsibility, and this was actually my entry into this topic when I was an undergraduate, because this unjustly affects the poor, this issue of climate change. Here you can see the world skewed according to poverty. This is the world those living on less than $1.25 a day, so you can see the poorest places are expanded, the wealthiest are contracted. And yet when we think about who's most responsible for carbon pollution historically, the graph is inversed. So this is carbon pollution from 1850 to 2011. The poorest places in the world are least responsible for causing this problem. The richest places in the world are most responsible. And so this is an issue of justice. As the German bishops have described, this great inequality between polluters and victims makes climate change into a fundamental problem of global justice. And so when we think about all this, I'm going to skip ahead because I want to make sure that we're on time in terms of the science. When we think about climate change and where it could possibly go, it's important to understand both feedbacks and tipping points. Feedbacks are understood as processes that increase an initial warming. So for example, we've talked about glacial melt. And so here you can see a glacier off the coast of northern Siberia. This was taken in the summer of 2013. This is the same glacier taken in the summer of 2018, 5 years later. And so you can see the glacial retreat. And this is significant because ice has a high albedo. It's reflective. It's why you wear light colored clothing in the summer to reflect heat. And as that ice has melted because of warming, it's exposed darker soil that's absorbed more of that solar radiation and actually sped up the warming process. Warming causes warming. And so this is setting in motion processes that may have tipping points. And tipping points refer to thresholds beyond which change is essentially irreversible. Or at least on any reasonable timetable, irreversible. When we think about climate change and tipping points, the goal articulated in the Paris Agreement, the United Nations, is to hold warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So remember, we've already warmed the planet about a full degree. Meeting this goal will require essentially cutting carbon pollution in half by 2030 relative to 2010 levels, and having the global economy go carbon neutral by 2050 in order to stay below this tipping point. To give you a sense of where we're at, we have gone up and up and up, and we are continuing that trajectory, setting aside the pandemic pause. We have some hope in terms of policies. We've got the Paris Agreement that the current administration has re-entered the United States into, but even this is insignificant. As the UN describes, if we rely only on Paris, we can expect 3 degrees or more of warming this century. So there's a significant gap between where Paris hopes to get us and where we actually are. And so when we think about the climate futures, this is a matter of justice, which Aquinas describes as a habit whereby a person renders what's due. And when we think about climate change futures, this is a matter of procedural justice. So this is from my colleague Rich Miller here at Creighton, who describes that if you're putting someone at risk, you have a duty to inform them of the risk. It becomes a matter of procedural justice. And when we think about climate futures, there are a lot of possible scenarios. So we could see warming more or less at 1.5 degrees. We could also see warming up to 3, 4, and 5 degrees based on the choices that we make. And I think it's important to appreciate the gravity of this because 3, 4, and 5 degrees is a different world. This is 8, 10, 12, 15 feet of sea level rise, 20 feet of sea level rise. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like, this is a model of southern Florida and Miami and the Keys under 10 feet of sea level rise. And this isn't just Superstorm Sandy, the water goes up and then it goes away. This is underwater, 10 feet of sea level rise. 20 feet of sea level rise, so if we get into 4 and 5 degrees of warming, you can again see what that would be projected to look like in places like Miami, San Francisco, Boston, Venice Beach. 20 feet of sea level rise is truly a different world. So I think it's important to appreciate this because it hopefully catalyzes a sense of urgency, and especially for those who are committed to Catholic social teaching and all of its different commitments. I think this is especially important to appreciate. So again, this is Richard Miller, and here he's citing two preeminent climate scientists, Kevin Anderson and Hans Schellenhuber. Schellenhuber is on the Vatican's Pontifical Academy of Sciences. And they've suggested that at 4 to 6 degrees of warming, the carrying capacity of the planet could be reduced to between 500 million and 1 billion people. Obviously, this is a projection. Obviously, this is a model, but this is terrifying in terms of what this would entail. The current population of the world is 7.7 billion people. The carrying capacity of 1 billion would be the death of 6.7 billion people, 87% of the current global population. Climate change is a life issue. And so as Bishop McElroy has described, the death, for example, from abortion is more imminent, but the long-term death from unchecked climate change is larger and threatens the very future of humanity. And so as Bishop Stowe has described, it could be argued that creation is the preeminent issue because without the environment to sustain human life, you cannot have human life. So this is a life issue. This is essential to the Catholic tradition. This is essential to the Church's mission, its fidelity. And I'm going to skip ahead because I want to get to the Catholic tradition and where we are and where we might go. When we think about the potential of the Catholic Church, it's almost ideal in terms of addressing the climate crisis. We've got essentially all the resources that are needed. We've got the mission, we've got the ethics. We've also got people. We've got 70 million Catholics, 20% of the US adult population. So we've got lots and lots of people. We've got institutional structures, so 176 dioceses across the United States. We've got 17,000 parishes, communities that could operationalize this teaching. We've got leadership. We've got over 400 active and retired bishops, 35,000 priests, 18,000 deacons. We've got money. We've got billions of dollars, and we've got socially responsible investment guidelines. So we've got resources there. We've got advocacy networks through the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, but also state Catholic conferences. We've got education systems. We've got a commitment to evangelization, so speaking and acting. We've got healthcare systems that consume tremendous amounts of energy and have advocacy power. And we've got infrastructure. We've got over 100,000 buildings estimated in the U.S. Catholic Church that consume energy, that could draw from different energy sources, that could increase their energy efficiency. And we've got millions of acres of land that could site solar and wind projects. So the Catholic tradition has a tremendous amount of potential. Unfortunately, we have not realized this potential, at least in my estimation and informed by conversation with lots and lots of Catholics. So this is drawing from an article that I was published after the conference that we had here on Laudato Si in 2019, where I'm suggesting that the U.S. Catholic response has not been anywhere near what is commensurate with the science and the magnitude of what Francis describes as the climate emergency. So we've done some things, but but it's not anywhere near commensurate with what's required. So just a couple of statistics. 1 month after Laudato Si, only 22% of US Catholics who regularly attend Mass reported having heard about the encyclical. Several months later, less than 20% had heard about climate change discussed in their place of worship. Numerous US Catholics described to the Catholic Climate Covenant and our partners that institutions still haven't integrated creation care and climate justice as essential into catechesis, worship, and priestly formation. Catholic facilities managers observed that relatively few Catholic institutions have developed science-based systematic plans for energy reduction and renewable energy planning. And unfortunately, lots of theologians have talked about this issue, but among our colleagues, there's been a recognition that fewer have led passionate, organized, and persistent campaigns to enact this in their institutions and in their dioceses. As I said, we've got state Catholic conferences, we've got dioceses, we've got all of this potential, and yet unfortunately it doesn't seem to be realized. And we can talk about why that is. In the United States, political identity is the single biggest predictor of climate change beliefs. If you want to know where someone stands on climate change, ask their political affiliation. And this raises uncomfortable questions about what our fundamental values and root paradigms are. Thinking about what is really animating the way that people live and purchase and consume and invest. And as Richard Gula describes here, Christian beliefs have a great deal to do with shaping what we see, but there are other identities, namely, in this case, political identities. About half of US Catholics identify or lean as Republican, more than half of white Catholics identify as or lean Republican. And it's unsurprising, therefore, that less than half of white US Catholics say climate change is a critical issue, and that shortly after Laudato Si, there was a study conducted by some social scientists who surveyed Republican Catholics and found that, cross-pressured by the inconsistency between the pontiff's views and those of their allies, conservative Catholics devalued the Pope's credibility on climate change. This suggests that the worldviews, political identities, and group norms that lead conservative Catholics to deny climate change override their deference to religious authority when judging the realities and risks of this phenomenon. So we have to grapple with political identity, and actually the article that you see here is the lead article on National Catholic Reporter today by myself and a colleague and a student who talk about why it is that maybe we've seen this shift, this political ideological shift in the US Catholic Church. So lots of reasons to think about this. Two more that one other that I'll just suggest is from a book by Aaron Lothus, who talks about different gaps in the US Catholic community. So, for example, there's a knowledge gap. We think about scientific literacy, understanding climate science, but also catechetical gaps. Understanding Catholic social teaching is essential to Catholic mission. We can talk about a caring gap. Francis describes this as the sin of indifference in Laudato Si, but also needing a culture of encounter where people encounter both creation, but also those impacted by environmental degradation. And then we can talk about an action gap. People may know, they may care to some degree, but they fail to take action as far as charitable works or social justice for lots of reasons, right? We're all busy, we're comfortable, we're kind of in our habits. Maybe we don't have the capacity to take on another concern or another issue. And I think there's also a political aversion, or people are potentially conflict averse and aren't comfortable taking all of this up. And so when we think about all of this, I think it's important to recognize the potential, but also the failure here in the US to think about this in terms of essential to Catholic mission. And so very briefly, and I'll just provide some resources that folks can engage on their own, but when we think about pathways forward, there's hope. As Francis says here, all is not lost. We're capable of choosing differently. There's always a way out. We can redirect our steps. And so there are things that we can do and changes that we can make in order to move forward and better care for our common home. So we can talk about, I'll skip this and just provide the resources. As I said, I'm a consultant with Catholic Climate Covenant, so there are lots of resources available to equip and empower communities to address this issue. So we've got this resource for Catholic higher education. We've got creation care teams that work in parishes. This is the diocesan, the Archdiocesan Plan for Laudato Si in the Archdiocese of Atlanta. This is a resource from the Catholic Health Association, thinking about how to better care for creation and healthcare ministry. And our partners at Global Catholic Climate Movement have talked about fossil fuel divestment, informed by the Vatican's recent emphasis on this as a way to mitigate the climate crisis. We also have a Catholic Climate Covenant. We've got Catholic Energies, and so hopefully folks are familiar with this. This is a project that works to design, implement, and also finance renewable energy projects in Catholic institutions. And so here you can see some examples of the work that we've done in parishes, also for Catholic Charities in the Archdiocese of Washington, installing the largest solar array in Washington, D.C. So lots of opportunities, lots of potential, and also an upcoming opportunity that I'll flag for folks. There's the conference series on our common home that's co-sponsored by Creighton and Catholic Climate Covenant. Hopefully folks are aware of this. It's a biennial conference series, the first of which was last summer in 2019. Or 2 summers ago in 2019. This initiative brings together U.S. Catholics to try and discern how to better integrate Laudato Si into all the church's different missions and ministries. And this year it'll be in concert with the Vatican's Laudato Si Action Platform. So we're looking at ways to integrate Laudato Si across 8 different ministries of the U.S. Catholic Church. As I said, the first conference was held in 2019 here at Creighton. The keynote address and plenaries were published in this Journal of Moral Theology, so if folks are interested in reading those. As I said, it's a biennial conference series, so this current summer, this upcoming summer in July, we'll have the next iteration. It'll be virtual, obviously, because of the pandemic. We'll have opening keynotes from Cardinal Supich and Maureen Day at the Franciscan School of Theology. But as we're working towards the summer, we've got working groups that are collaborating in each of these different 8 ministerial tracks or sectors to try and come up with resources and strategies and tactics to be able to integrate Laudato Si across these different ministries of the U.S. Catholic Church. So, so that's an exciting opportunity for folks who are interested in more deeply integrating this into the life and ministry of the U.S. Catholic community. So, with that, I will stop and turn things back over to Bill as a way to facilitate dialogue with the Archbishop, but I'm so grateful for the opportunity to present what I know is a lot of information, but hopefully is of help to folks and gives them resources moving forward.
Well, thanks so much, Dan. This is really tremendous. You've given us an extremely valuable and informative presentation. So thank you very much. We have a lot to think about and a lot to discuss. Let me remind everyone that at any time you post your questions and comments in the Q&A bar, which is a little bubble with a question mark. You just type thoughts, comments you might have to Dr. Dileo, and we'll get to those shortly. But before we do that, we also have an opportunity tonight to hear from Archbishop Michael Jacles, as I mentioned earlier. We in the Catholic Church receive so much of our guidance from our ordained leaders. And so I'm very grateful that Archbishop Jacles is able to speak to us tonight, not as long as Dr. Dileo, but a shorter reflection on this very important topic as well. So Archbishop Jacles, thank you again for coming and speaking with us tonight.
Again, thank you for the invitation, and Dr. Dileo, thank you for a tremendous presentation, thought-provoking. Wow. And I suppose that in thinking about it, I'd have to say, you know, through my most grievous fault, I'll try and do better. Our Holy Father Francis, long may he serve as our Pope, often organizes his remarks around tres palabras, or tre parole, or 3 points. And I'm going to steal that schema to make my response. The first palabra. Sure, everybody is aware that among U.S. Catholics there is a debate about whether some issues are more important than others. For example, some insist that the so-called life issues are preeminent, like opposition to the death penalty or abortion or physician-assisted suicide and embryonic stem cell research. The problem is that labeling some issues as preeminent gives the impression that we can ignore the merely eminent issues, like racism or brutality from or towards police, or poverty, or immigration reform, and protecting the environment. I wonder, though, if it has to be a life issue to be preeminent. This is, I think, linked to what we heard about the interconnectedness and essential. What is it about that second category of issues, especially the environment, that isn't about life? We defend the fundamental right to life, yes, but we also defend what people need to live in dignity: productive work and fair wages, food and shelter, education and health care, and protection from harm. And we defend the earth, because where else will the people live whose right to life we fight for? The debate has highlighted and heightened the division among U.S. Catholics, with people claiming to be either pro-life or pro-social concerns. But we aren't either-or people. Rather, we are both-and people, concerned both about life from womb to tomb and the earth. Which leads to the second parole. For a person of faith, stewardship is key to our duty to protect the environment. And if you're familiar with stewardship, it isn't just about money, but pertains to all that we are and have and can do, all that we possess, as well as pertaining to other people and their possessions, and creation too. It's a way of life that affirms that we don't own anything. Everything is on loan from God, entrusted to us to manage according to God's purpose. For our part, we're honored that God would entrust us with God's stuff, and we hold precious what God has entrusted to us. God made it, God owns it. My life, your life, my possessions, your possessions, our common home, the earth, all of it, the splendor of God. Whatever we're talking about, it isn't mine to do with as I please. Having dominion, like Eve and Adam, isn't licensed to misuse, abuse, or use selfishly. Even and especially born and preborn human life, flora and fauna, fish and fowl, water and air, soil and rocks, bless the Lord. God, the owner, would have us use the fruits of the earth to provide for ourselves and our dependents, but also to provide for the poor, and for the church to be able to continue the mission of Jesus in its ministries. The third word is that stewardship is part of Catholic social teaching related to private property, the universal destination of goods and creation. It's not uncommon to hear people criticize Pope Francis for his comments on these topics, saying that he's just a wild-eyed South American liberal. But what the Pope says is not his private opinion, but the same teaching given by popes in the modern era and enshrined in the Catholic Catechism. References to that teaching go back to Leo XIII in Rerum Novarum that we heard reference to, published in 1891. Far from wild-eyed and liberal, both Pope Leo and those times. In fact, Pope Leo XIII wrote that encyclical in order to counter claims made by communists and socialists against the ownership of private property. Catholic teaching defends the right to own private property, but as it also defends the duty as stewards to share with others the universal destination of goods. This right and duty go hand in hand. We may possess land and resources as private property, but for the purpose of encouraging our care and industry in its regard, as well as providing for a just distribution of its fruits to others, especially to the poor. It isn't holding private property that is the problem, but what we do with it. For example, Catherine of Siena in her dialogue insists that God doesn't neglect the poor, but provides for them by giving some people more than they need. The intent is that they would then be, as she refers to it, they would then be distributors to the poor of what they don't need for themselves. Unfortunately, they selfishly keep it and pile it up. Again, dominion doesn't mean God's stuff is mine to do with as I please. It's rarely legitimate for people of faith to use the words I, me, and mine, unless you want to say, I confess, or it's my fault. Rather, we speak in terms of we, you, and others. Read the Grant study. The doctor has all kinds of, both of them have all kinds of books behind them. I just have a Cornhuskers plaque. But read the Grant study from Harvard University. It's scientifically proven that happiness and a filled, full life is the fruit of living for, giving to, helping out, sharing with, serving, even sacrificing self, not only for the benefit of another person, but also for the benefit of Earth, our common home. We, you, and ours, not me, but thee, God and others, and the earth as well. So, my conclusion, the message of these tres palabras or tre parole, or these three words is, we are concerned about both life from womb to tomb and the earth, the only place where all living things have to live. Second, whatever we're talking about, my life or yours, my property or yours, or the earth and all living things, it isn't mine to do with as I please. And third, the right to hold private property has a corresponding duty to exercise care and industry in its regard, especially land and natural resources, and to provide a just distribution of its fruits to the poor. Amen. May it be so. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Archbishop Jacles, for helping illuminate further the Catholic teaching about our duties with respect to the needs of the world and the earth, and how those duties truly inform how we should think about possession and use of the natural world. we come now to the most open-ended part of our evening tonight, our discussion time. And we have a couple questions that have come in directed to Dr. Dileo. So I'll throw those out first. And if there's other questions listeners have, please go ahead and type them in. First, a practical question. Are you willing to share your slides, especially because of all the resources you list there?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. And I apologize. I know it was more than I was able to get through. Especially with the NCR piece this morning, I tried to fit that in towards the end, and there was more than I was able to get through. But absolutely, I'm happy to share this with folks, and hopefully it'll be a foundation and a resource for folks moving forward.
Great, thanks very much, Dan. One other question to you. I'm guessing that this is coming from our president here at Clark. To sort of just have the first name to go on, but I'm pretty confident. You mentioned how well staffed the Catholic world is, and thinking about Catholic universities and all the students that we have. How can our students, in your view, join the cause and be mobilized to take greater care for the earth?
Yeah, so it's a wonderful question, and I think in many ways that's what we would hope for as church. And we talk about the new evangelization, and we talk about connecting with young people, and this issue is demonstrably demographically what young people care about. You know, Pew and so many other places have shown that. So this is something that I think we can actually make an evangelical connection to in terms of empowering young people. I'm speaking in terms of our own experience here at Creighton. Recently, we made the announcement to divest our endowment from fossil fuels within the next 10 years. And in many ways, that was animated and catalyzed by our students who not only understood the Catholic tradition, but also understood principles of organizing, and they understood the importance of relationship building, because I think that was something that our students were so intentional about in terms of building relationships with our leaders on campus. And it's interesting because the director of Catholic Climate Covenant, Dan Misla, always responds to questions about difficulties, enacting this by asking, what's your relationship like with your fill in the blank, with your bishop, with your priest, with your parish council president? What's your relationship like? And so I think in that way, emphasizing to students that it's about relationship building. At the same time, I would also say be careful what you wish for in terms of empowering or sparking interest among students, because our students were fairly tenacious in terms of persistently advocating for mission-based action that that was rooted in justice in terms of reforming structures and policies. So I think helping students to understand the tradition, to understand the foundation, to understand the importance of relationships, but then also giving them space to challenge and to push and to engage in prophetic witness oftentimes. So I'm not sure if that directly answers the question, but based on my experience with students, that's what immediately comes to mind.
Great, thanks very much, Dan. I have another question. It's actually for both of you now, and it gets to some of those uncomfortable numbers you were quoting about political affiliation. And I guess what I'm wondering about is, you look at the teaching of the church, and it seems to be fairly clear that the climate change is recognized as an urgent issue, and Catholics and all people have an urgent duty to respond to it. That part's clear, but what do you do with the significant numbers of Catholics who are in many cases active, church-going, and in good conscience dismiss the issue as either non-existent or in some cases a some kind of falsification of the true Catholic faith. Like that strikes me as a fairly big pastoral problem. So Dan, maybe I could start with you first, and then we could hear from Archbishop Jekyll. So.
Sure. I think, and I'd be more interested to hear from the Archbishop from a pastoral perspective. I guess most immediately, I'll just say that I think from my experience, it's often a catechetical issue, at least in many ways a foundationally catechetical issue, because folks just aren't aware of the church's teaching about this issue. I've been doing this for more than 10 years, and most people still haven't encountered the church's teaching on this issue. And I think it's catechetical in terms of ethics, but also in terms of mission, understanding Catholic social teaching generally, but climate specifically as, again, essential to the church and its mission. So speaking as an educator, my mind immediately goes to catechesis and education as the initial first step. But Archbishop, I'm not sure, especially based on your pastoral experiences, how you would answer that question.
Well, as a former teacher and teacher of teachers, I would agree that education is certainly a big factor. You can just based on the principle, you can't love what you don't know. You can't love a teaching that you don't know. You can't love a person that you don't know. And I would say that we have to keep hitting a topic or a theme again and again and again. I hope I'm not being, a Debbie Downer, but as much as much stock as I put into education, there's something going on. Oh, there's something going on with my computer. There's something going on in the modern age. I just think that a lot of people, if it does not coincide or doesn't match what they believe, then they dismiss it. I think of an example. During this pandemic, I've preached about an awful lot about the common good, which is why we wear a mask and socially distance. And people say, you make much about this common good, but it's not even in the catechism. And so I pointed out where it is in the catechism, and that's the last I hear about it. That people will just, whether it's the environment or social teaching, the common good, if it doesn't match up what they already believe, then it's, I think, almost a miracle for them to open their minds and hearts enough to receive the teaching. Again, I hope I'm not being too black about or negative about this whole notion, but it's been my experience, but I keep hitting at it, repetitio est mater studiorum, they say. Repetition is the mother of studies, or I'm going to keep hitting at it until it starts to make a dent.
Thanks very much. I have kind of a follow-up question to what both of you had said, and I guess it's acknowledging the reality perhaps of a deeper problem than just knowledge. I notice in the writings of Pope Francis, he does spend time clarifying what the mission of the church is, but he also spends a great deal of time trying to motivate. And in other words, I think sometimes our problem isn't just the head, it's the heart. It's something deeper in the way of conversion that seems to be needed, maybe on this issue, maybe on other issues. Like, it's like what St. Augustine said. I don't remember it exactly, but Lord, convert me, just not yet. You know? So I'm wondering, like, knowing that there's resistance out there and knowing that in some cases education alone might not do it. I mean, do you have another tool in your bag? I throw this out to both of you. So Dan, I don't know if there's other things that you've drawn on.
Yeah, well, I think so. I think education is the. I should have clarified that I don't think education is the panacea. I think it's the first step to making sure that folks have a solid foundation. I think there are a couple of other ways to maybe complement education. The first of which is spirituality, understood as encounter, and I think that's so important. And this is one of my favorite lines from Laudato Si, where Francis writes that a commitment this lofty cannot be sustained by doctrine alone, without a spirituality capable of inspiring us, without an interior impulse which encourages, motivates, nourishes, and gives meaning to our individual and communal activity. So when you talk about education, it's, you know, the head-heart divide. I think, you know, giving people facts and catechesis and theology is important, but part of how we learn and part of how we are inspired is through encounter, understood as spirituality with God, or encounter with persons and communities. And so it's not just about books, it's about meeting people and encountering God in creation. But then the other also tool in terms of responding to this, I do think, is insights from the social sciences about social action, political advocacy, and community organizing. That it's not enough to just talk about the principles. There have to be strategies and campaigns and movements to enact and operationalize those. And that's, again, what our students, I think, did for so long here in terms of working on divestment, that it was talking about and educating people about church teaching, but it was also very strategically working and building relationships and, you know, doing actions on campus that were strategic in a way that would advance and enact this mission. So I think education is the start, but I think it needs to be bookended by spirituality and some notion of action and advocacy to continue to move it forward.
Thank you very much, Dan. Archbishop Jacobs, I don't know if you had something in addition to add on that, or otherwise I can move to the next question too. Okay, so I have really one more big question, which I'll direct to both of you, and so again, Dr. Dileo kind of laid out the great potential of the Catholic Church as well as maybe the meager results. And we had a specific question about universities already, but if we think about the wider institutions of the church, all of them, you know, from schools to hospitals to, you know, the parishes, to the huge numbers of lay people, what would it take to start treating this problem as essential and not simply optional? And there's perhaps many ways to answer that, and it might even overlap a little bit with what you've said already. But, you know, what could it take, just for the leadership, I suppose, or this institutional structures in the Catholic Church to tilt in the other direction? Dan, do you want to start?
No, Archbishop, do you have thoughts? I have thoughts. Do you have initial thoughts?
The first thing that occurs to me is that people wake up when they feel a prick in their side, and whether it is you know, vocations to priesthood or the needs of the poor, any issue whatsoever, they become aware and awakened and I think prone to action when they feel that, you know, there's a consequence. There's either an attractive consequence or a negative consequence to my involvement is the attraction or my lack thereof, and to the negative consequence. And on a small level, I have employed that, and to some good effect, but it's a long haul.
Yeah, I think thinking about effects, I think ideally, so there's a political theorist named Gene Sharp who talks about methods or mechanisms of change in society and kind of how change occurs, and it can occur through conversion, kind of appeals to ethics and appeals to principles. But when that fails, he's identified a theory of social change that starts to stair-step and escalate beyond just appeals and education. And kind of the case study, or one of the case studies that he talks about, is the Montgomery bus boycotts, where you had largely, persons of faith advocating for desegregation, and those calls were largely ignored. And as a result, there was an escalation. There was a discerned, faith-based move to try and, as you said, Archbishop, to try and prick the consciousnesses of persons in the community, essentially through action that challenged either power and authority, or challenged and set up the potential for losses, right, in terms of the bus boycotts, impacting the city budget, things like that. And so I think, thinking about our own church, ideally this would occur through conversion and appeals to authentic church teaching. Unfortunately, that hasn't worked so far, at least in my experience, writ large. And so I think, to the extent that change is going to happen, I suspect that it might happen more broadly as the result of persons in the church and groups in the church beginning to take some of the insights from social sciences and community organizing and applying them within our own church, and beginning to have some challenging and prophetic conversations with their leaders in parishes and dioceses and institutions, kind of framing kind of action reaction, in terms of, this is what we hope for, and this is what may occur if this doesn't happen here in the community. So I think, and there's precedent in the Christian community for this type of nonviolent engagement, but the appeal to conversion so far has largely been ineffective. Again, as I said, at least commensurate with the gravity of the issue. So I think that's where I would anticipate more substantial change coming from, if I had to guess.
Good. Thank you, Dan. We got two more questions that have come in. I'll just direct one to each of you. So, Archbishop Jacobs, if you could help us with this one. Someone wrote in here, in my experience, abortion is the only issue that most of my Catholic friends consider when they vote. That usually means a vote for Republicans. Climate change and the environment always seems to be more of a Democratic concern. How does one reconcile these two concerns when voting?
Thank you very much for inviting me to tonight. Yeah, well, that is a classic example of what I was talking about, of the either or people. There's the pro-life and the let's say pro-environment, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, and never the twain shall meet. And so my message has always been that we are both and it is not a sin to belong to a particular party. It's not a sin to vote for a particular candidate. We have to take all the things into consideration. That's where leaders in the conference, the Episcopal Conference, started talking about We need to make sure that everybody understands that this is preeminent, and what they wanted to say by that is that this is the only issue, the abortion issue, is the only one that you should consider when you're casting a vote or what have you. And there was another side that said, well, you can't just ignore the other eminent issues, and it's a difficult thing. I often say that we have to form our consciences on the gospel and not on a political party platform. I don't have anything. I'm sure Dr. Dileo has an answer to it that will change the world and make it a better place. Let's hear.
Thank you.
Well, and I teach voting in several of my classes, and I think it's the way that we approach it is that we don't vote for issues, we vote for people, and we vote for people to the degree that they will promote or undermine core values. And we have to recognize that values transcend issues, and no issue has a monopoly on a particular value. And so when we think about values, again, we have to recognize that they're interconnected. And so all values are significant in terms of conscientious discernment. And ultimately, as you said, Archbishop, it's a matter of conscientious discernment about which candidate is going to, on balance, protect values and ensure that there's not an undermining of core values.
Thank you very much. It reminds me again of what John Paul II said about mission. It's a single but complex reality. I think, maybe to end on a note of hope, Dr. Dileo, if you could just share with us, I don't know if you've ever had that special student that really absorbs the significance of this challenge, and I've had a few where they get it and they're afraid. What do you say to give hope to people? What do you say to those students?
I'm laughing because I have definitely had those students, and one in particular has appropriated all of this, and we're in a class on hope actually this semester, and we talk about hope as aspiration for a difficult but possible future. And that aspiration is underpinned by a recognition that it's possible, but it's possible only through action. And I think that's where a source of hope is, certainly for me, but I think a lot of the students that I've worked with, that there's hope in the recognition that we have agency and power and the capacity to make different choices and potentially push for different choices. As Francis says, this didn't just happen, and it won't necessarily just happen moving forward. We have the capacity to make different choices, and for me, I think agency is a source of hope when I think about this issue and thinking about conversations with students.
Great, thanks very much, Dr. Dileo and Archbishop Jacobs. I think that's a great way to draw our evening to a close on that note. And I think we can pray together that we may recognize our agency and our power, and that God may give us that recognition. My thanks to everyone, to all of you out there listening, and of course to our two speakers tonight. And behind the scenes, I'd also like to thank our one and only enterprise architect, Colin Menster, who has organized the technical side of things. We're very grateful for your help, Colin. So from Clark University in Dubuque, I wish you all a peaceful evening, and in the future, busy hands and hearts and minds to treasure our planet together. Good night.